this is just talking about the histogram. You know, in the end, I'm looking at the image, but the histogram just tells me if there are any problems that are large enough that maybe I want to correct them before I even look at the image. And so here are some of the things that can happen. First off, these little arrows just show you what I'm looking at in the histogram, just say what's important about it. So if there's ever a gap on this side and there is a spike on the opposite, what that really means is that the image is too dark, it's underexposed, and when there's a spike on the left side, it's almost as if you have a histogram that doesn't have a spike. It's just that part of it's hidden. It's going beyond the edge. It's like this. It would be as if this is the area where the histogram could show up, but because you're underexposed, it's pushed beyond the edge, and that means some things are darker than black in your picture. And all this stuff that extends beyond the edge of the histogram, all this stuff right here, just gets stacked on top of each other and becomes a spike. And it's saying there might be extra stuff down there, and that if we somehow shove the histogram that way, I might be able to get it back. And in general, if there's a gap on one side, that means that the whole histogram's over a bit. And exposure is what's going to move the whole histogram around. So that just tells me, hey, it looks like the whole thing is just too far this way. So go that way. Right? If, on the other hand, it's more of a normal histogram, there's no gap on this side, but there's still a spike on this, then I don't have to move the whole histogram. Because if I do, then this end of it could go off the end and turn into a spike. You'd have a lot of areas of solid white. It's only if there's gap in spike that I automatically think of exposure. If there's no gap, but there's a spike on one side, that's when I go for, if it's on this side, blacks. If it's on this side, whites. So the gap and the spike thing is exposure. And it depends on what direction. Just think of the slider. If you move it to the right, this thing goes to the right. If you move it to the left, this thing goes left. So if you glance at it, gap and spike, move exposure. Whatever way it would go in order to make it so it's not falling off the end and turn it into that spike. Right? But if, on the other hand, it's not that the whole thing is shoved one direction or another. In general, it's there. It's just one end has a spike. Then if it's on this side, whites. If it's on that side, blacks. Hopefully that helps you a little bit. So then this, I don't know how helpful this is going to be, but this is a histogram. And just to kind of describe what the sliders do as a whole, whites works on the absolute brightest part of your picture, however bright that happens to be. And it's going to take that and make it brighter or make it darker. Brightest part. Blacks works on the darkest part, does the same thing. But if those areas are okay, if they're where you need them to be, then if you want to work on things that are a little bit darker than the brightest part of your picture, it's highlights. If you want to work on the things that are a little bit, I'm sorry, did I say brighter? A little bit darker than your highlights, or darker than your whites. Here, if you want things a little bit brighter than blacks, then it's shadows you want to go to. And if it's the histogram as a whole, it's jammed too far this way, jammed too far this way, it's exposure. Going to move the whole darn thing. The thing I could add to that would be contrast. Contrast is going to take the bright stuff and the dark stuff, and it's going to control how wide this gap is. If I increase contrast, this stuff is going to get brighter, this stuff is going to get darker, so there'll be a bigger difference between the two. You can do that for images that look dull. They look foggy, they look hazy. Contrast is going to break through the haze. If you lower contrast, it's going to bring this in and bring this in, and it makes the brighter stuff and the darker stuff more similar. That would be if you have way too much contrast. The shadows are sitting there way too dark, highlights are way too bright, you need them to become a little bit more similar. It would be contrast that you deal with. That, I don't know how helpful it is, but for some of you it would be. Okay? So that's what's going on in my head when I'm thinking about tonal adjustments with Camera Raw. When it comes to color, remember with the histogram, you look at the white part of the histogram for tonality, meaning brightness, and you look at the colored part when it comes to color. I mainly look at the ends and the overall shape. The middle and what shape it is determined by your picture. Take a picture of a dark thing, it's going to have tall stuff near the left. Take a picture of a bright thing, it's going to have tall stuff near the right. Take a picture of a gray wall, it's going to be in the middle. It's going to vary depending on the photo. There's no like right shape for the middle. And then keep in mind that when you see me get back highlight detail or shadow detail out of an image, you're not going to be able to do that from a JPEG or a TIFF. Got to be a RAW file to get that extra detail back. So if there was a spike on one end of the histogram with JPEG or TIFF, you're stuck with it. You can move where it is, but detail's not going to magically appear there. The same is true when it comes to white balance. White balance, we can radically change the colors. You remember that image of in the winery of all the bottles, how terrible that looked? Well, you can make it look as good as it would be if you had your camera set to the perfect white balance setting in Camera Raw, if it's a RAW file. If it's a JPEG file, you're going to find you can do much less. When you start moving that, you can move it a little bit, move it a lot, and you'll find that the image just doesn't look very good. And it'll be sometimes a dramatic difference. Okay? Also, I should mention that with JPEG files, the sliders will be in different positions. For instance, temperature and tint will always start at 0 because it doesn't know what you shot your image with, and it just says from where we are right now, I can make it more yellow or more blue. It doesn't say what was my camera set to at the time I took it, whereas this does. When you look at some of the other sliders, you'll find they just won't quite be as effective. And that's why I shoot with RAW, I would say 95% of the time. The other 5% is when I need to give somebody else these images immediately afterwards, and they don't know how to deal with RAW files, so I might give them some JPEGs. My card just filled up, and oh my God, look at what's happening in front of me. I must shoot it. I don't have time to delete images off and stuff. Fine, click over to JPEG and hope the heck I remember so I can switch back before I do a big shoot. Also, another thing I should mention is during the break, I talked with the creativeLIVE folks a bit about my screen, and it does sound like my screen is darker than what you're seeing. So if you ever see me over brighten something, that's why. Is this screen here, due to the way they capture the video, doesn't quite look the same as a computer monitor would or what you might be seeing on the live feed. So if you ever notice things going way too far when it comes to brightness, like I'm surprised at when I move the shadow slider that it wasn't as effective on some of these images, and it's just because my view here is a little darker. So just good to know that so you don't think my tastes are to over brighten everything.